You want to try animation, but all you have on your iPad is Procreate. Buying another program looks expensive, not to mention all the time it'll take to learn. So the question is, can you learn to animate in Procreate, or is it too limited? If you're wondering how far Procreate can actually take you in animation, I'll show you what you can realistically do inside Procreate. I'll show you where it shines, where there are those limits, and what learning animation in there really looks like. Plus, keep an eye out. Any animations that you see with this symbol in the video, those animations were made using Procreate. So let's start with the big question. Is Procreate enough to do animation? The answer is yes, if you want to try animation for the first time and you don't want to buy a new program. Procreate is absolutely capable of creating animations. I've been doing animations in Procreate for over a year now. I'm a professional animator, specifically a motion designer, and I love using Procreate for my simpler animations, which actually brings me to what you can realistically do in Procreate. You can do a lot of animations. Your creativity is not the limit. I have found through my own testing that Procreate is really great when it comes to simple animations. These animations can look like looping animations, testing motion, and maybe one simple scene. But just because this is what Procreate is best at doesn't mean that you're limited by only doing those things. In fact, you only start hitting Procreate's limits when you start to build more complex projects. But just because you start finding Procreate's limits doesn't mean you have to stop. Because for every limit that there is also a workaround. This is a section where I'm going to cover those limits. But the thing that you need to understand is that this isn't going to be all doom and gloom. We're artists. We're constantly thinking outside the box. We're constantly coming up with ways to figure out how to make something work. And just because there is a problem doesn't mean you can't come at it from another angle and build it anew. So let me lay out the problems that you will probably hit in Procreate. There are 3 big limits when it comes to animating in Procreate. Layers. Number 1 actually has 2 parts. Procreate only lets you have a certain number of layers in your artwork. Since you're new to animation in Procreate, every layer equals a frame. A frame in animation equals a fraction of a second. 12 drawings make up 1 second of animation. So that is why Procreate is very good for those short animations. Because if you want to do a long animation, you're probably not going to have enough layers to do it. The other limit that comes around because of the layers equal a frame, I hinted at this, but it is that a layer literally equals 1 drawing, which means you can't have a whole bunch of layers. For example, the mouth on one layer and then having the eyes on another layer and your face on another layer, because that would be 3 frames, and it would play where you'd first see the face, then you would see the eyes, and then you would see the mouth. They would all have to be on 1 layer, and if you were to animate that, it would be a little difficult because you'd have to erase and rebuild it constantly. So everything would have to exist on 1 layer. That's one limit of Procreate, but a very simple workaround, which I will get to in a moment. The second limit is that Procreate does not let you rig. You can think of rigging as pretty much putting puppet strings on your character. And the way that in professional programs you do this with the rig is that there's something called an anchor point or a pin, and you would put it by the joints. So by the wrist, by the elbow, and by the shoulder. And then it would create the movements because your puppet would move. But Procreate has no rigging, which means you'd have to draw the character one right after the next. And the last of Procreate's limits is that there is 1 timeline. A timeline in animation is where you would see all of your frames, all of your drawings on the bottom, and you would be able to play through them. If you go into a program like After Effects, you would be able to have multiple layers on your timeline. The fact that you can only have 1 timeline and you can't have layers means that you can't string together scenes. 1 timeline is very limited. However, remember, this isn't about the doom. There is also hope because there are several workarounds. The first workaround is for the layers. The biggest problems were that you have a limit on layers and that everything has to be in 1 layer for it to equal 1 drawing, 1 frame. So the easiest way to do that is to keep everything in 1 layer. You don't want to merge everything into 1 layer because then you're going to have to redraw again and again everything. And that is a long, tedious, boring process. So you're going to want to group your layers in order that it looks like it's 1 layer. And Procreate is going to count it as 1 layer and 1 drawing, and it solves your problem. The second way to get around the layer limits is you're going to set a background or a foreground. Since you've illustrated things before, you know that there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. If you have the same background for everything, you can set that as a background in Procreate, and it's going to appear for all your frames. You can do the same thing with a foreground layer if your character is moving behind something. Limit number 2 was rigging. I still am working on finding the best solution, but right now there is a way that you can select parts of limbs and you can twist them and turn them. I've done a video like that earlier, so I will link to it in the description if you want to check that out. And the final limitation was the singular timeline. And the biggest problem with that is that you can string multiple scenes together or cut in between. But the thing is, just because you are building your animation in Procreate doesn't mean you can't take it and put it into another program later on. This would mean learning the basics of a new software, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to buy a new software. There are several free editing softwares online that you can definitely use. Just off the top of my head, there is iMovie. There are definitely more free ones out there. I think DaVinci might even be it. And the entire part would just be taking your animations, putting them into a timeline, and then being able to piece them together. Now that you know what's possible in Procreate and where it might give you trouble, how do you actually start animating? Especially if you've never animated before. First off, the basics of the basics that you should know about animation. Animation just means you are making something move. You can learn to make better animation by applying the 12 principles of animation, but just to get started, all you have to remember is that you are taking something from point A and you are moving it to point B, and you are supposed to have fun doing it. Here's 3 simple ideas that you can try that just take that concept of making something move. One is dragging a ball across the screen. That is very much taking a point A and point B, and then you're trying to move the ball across. You could have it go very slowly. You could have this ball go really fast across, and oddly enough, while you do all these exercises, you'll be practicing some of the 12 principles of animation, just because that's the way you make things move, but you don't have to get invested and try to learn everything at once. Idea number 2 is the magic dot. The magic dot just means that you take your pen and you just dot it across your page. You start with frame 1, then you create a new frame or a new layer, and you move the dot forward. You try to do it so that your dot moves around in an arc and it looks like it's flying. You could also do it straight across again, similar to dragging the ball across the screen. Idea number 3 is a wave or wind animation. This one's a little bit different than the others because you'll start off by drawing a wind motion or a wind pattern that you want to do. And then you'll set it as your background so you can trace it. And then on your new layer, you're going to take your pen and you'll start at the very bottom. You'll do little by little. Then you'll do a new frame. You'll do a little bit more, maybe vanish a little bit at the end, maybe somewhere on one of the other lines. This one is more about figuring out how you offset animation instead of having every single piece move at the same time. Then again, you can have fun testing how fast or how slow you can make it move. What I especially like about these exercises I mentioned, you can go back to them as you learn more about animation and see how you improve. Then you'll be able to see the difference between pure Illustrator you and how you become this more animator Illustrator hybrid. Actually, thinking about it, there is a few differences between animation and illustration you should be aware of as you do animation. These have to do with your canvas size, the DPI, and illustration ideas versus animation perspective. Starting with canvas size, most illustrations will be based on printed size, but animation is usually based on video size. The standard size is 1920 by 1080. And if you're doing a social media post and it's vertical, it's just going to be flipping it. The second difference is DPI, dots per inch. If you're an illustrator and you print your work, that means that you're printing it at 300 DPI. That is a very high resolution to give you the best quality you can when you print it. But if you're a digital illustrator, you might already know that 72 is the DPI that you'd export your drawing at. And it's the same with video. Just to be clear, if you pick 72 as your DPI, you're not lowering the quality of your video. It's actually the standard for anything that you see on screen. And the third difference is illustration ideas versus animation perspective. I don't know what your illustration style is, but if you're an illustrator that likes doing a lot of detailed work, you want to be really careful when you come into animation, especially if you want to do characters. Character animation is so complicated, and the more details you add, the harder it is to animate. Let's say you have this pirate character, and they have a hat, they have a coat, they have a little button on the coat, they have buttons going down their coat, they have a gun, they have a sword, they have striped pants. Oh, stripes are the worst for the animators. If you look into any of the Disney stuff where they had to animate Cobb, the Snake and Jungle Book, you'll hear that he was a nightmare to animate because of his stripes. But my point being is that you can get complicated with your illustration. You can even bring some of that complicated illustration that you love doing into animation. Be prepared, you might not be able to animate it like a Disney animation. You might have to figure out a more stylistic animation way to do it, or you would have to simplify your character, because the simpler the character is, the easier it is to animate. So is Procreate enough to learn animation? It absolutely is. And if you find yourself liking it, you can even upgrade it to another 2D animation program later on. You'll have to learn a new software then, but the skills and the practice that you've done in Procreate, that will transfer over to a new program, because the actual way that you animate is what really matters when it comes to making animation. It's much less about the software. If you are ready to turn on those animation settings in Procreate, I have a whole video that goes into everything you need to know about animation in Procreate.